It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay, and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Princess Charlotte of Wales. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Behind those closed doors, a gathering had been arranged with an urgency that immediately set it apart from routine palace briefings. Prince William, Prince of Wales, was present, alongside senior advisors whose involvement alone suggested that whatever was unfolding carried consequences far beyond a simple family concern. Staff were quietly dismissed hours earlier than scheduled, corridors cleared with an efficiency that left even seasoned insiders unsettled, and access restricted to only a select few who understood the weight of silence. At the center of it all was Charlotte, yet no one was willing to speak openly about why. The absence of explanation became its own message, one that echoed louder than any official statement ever could. As the meeting concluded, it was Catherine's expression that ignited the first wave of unease. Those who caught even a fleeting glimpse described a shift they had never seen before, composed yet shaken, controlled yet unmistakably affected. It was not the reaction of someone responding to a passing concern. It was the reaction of someone who had just heard something irreversible. Moments later, William was seen with Charlotte, his demeanor noticeably different, closer, more attentive, almost protective in a way that did not go unnoticed. The contrast between his usual public composure and this quieter intensity sparked questions that no one inside the palace could comfortably answer. Whispers began to move swiftly, threading their way through private offices and guarded conversations. At first, they pointed toward a possible health concern, something serious enough to warrant secrecy, but manageable enough to contain. But that narrative began to unravel almost as quickly as it formed. The tone of the discussions, the presence of advisors not typically involved in medical matters, and the careful wording exchanged behind closed doors suggested something far more complex. It was not about illness. It was about something older, something deeply rooted in the structure of the monarchy itself. Then came the first subtle shift in language, small, almost unnoticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once it surfaced. The focus began to move away from immediate concern and toward legacy. Not just any legacy, but one tied to inheritance, symbolism, and the delicate balance of power within the royal family. Insiders started referencing conversations between Charlotte and Catherine that had taken place before the meeting, private exchanges that, until now, had been considered personal, even routine. But those conversations, it seemed, had triggered something much larger than anyone had anticipated. What made it more unsettling was the realization that this had not appeared out of nowhere. There had been signs, subtle changes in tone, quiet observations from those closest to the family, moments that, in hindsight, carried more meaning than they were given at the time. Media insiders would later admit that something had felt off for weeks, but without confirmation, those instincts were dismissed as speculation. Now, those same instincts were being re-examined under a very different light, as pieces of a much larger puzzle began to align. And as the whispers grew louder, one truth became impossible to ignore: this was not a fleeting moment of concern. It was the beginning of something far more significant. Something that reached deep into the foundations of royal tradition and challenged assumptions that had stood unquestioned for generations. The question was no longer what had happened inside that room, but what it meant for everything that would come after. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health. It was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried. Until now. No one expected it to come from Princess Charlotte of Wales herself. Not the aides, not the advisors, and certainly not the senior royals who suddenly found themselves scrambling to contain what had just been said. But those words, simple, direct, and unwavering, would ripple through the monarchy in ways no one could have predicted. It didn't arrive as a dramatic announcement or a carefully prepared statement. It came quietly, almost naturally, during a conversation that was never meant to leave the room. Yet the moment it was spoken, everything shifted. Charlotte's declaration was clear: she would only accept jewels from Catherine, Princess of Wales's personal collection. No ambiguity, no hesitation, just a firm boundary drawn in a place where boundaries were rarely set by those so young. And in that instant, what might have sounded like a child's preference took on a weight that no one in that room could ignore. The reaction was immediate, though carefully restrained. Senior royals exchanged glances that carried more meaning than words ever could. Those responsible for overseeing the royal vault, guardians of tradition, of continuity, of unspoken rules, felt the ground beneath them shift. Because this was not just about jewels, it was about what those jewels represented. Authority, legacy, trust. And suddenly, all of it felt uncertain. The silence that followed was not calm, it was calculation. A quiet effort to understand how something so small could carry such enormous implications. For Catherine, the moment was deeply personal. She had not anticipated this. No one had prepared her for it. Yet the emotion was unmistakable, not just surprise, but something deeper, something layered with pride and concern in equal measure. Because Charlotte's words were not just a preference, they were a statement of allegiance, a reflection of where she felt her connection truly belonged. And while that connection might have seemed natural to an outsider, within the structure of the monarchy, it disrupted an unspoken balance that had been maintained for generations. Nearby, Prince William, Prince of Wales, absorbed the moment differently. He did not challenge it. He did not redirect it. Instead, he stood quietly in support, his reaction subtle but unmistakable. It was not a declaration, but it didn't need to be. His silence carried its own authority, reinforcing Charlotte's stance in a way that words might have complicated. And in doing so, he signaled something far more significant: a willingness to prioritize personal conviction over rigid expectation. But beyond the immediate circle, the implications began to spread. Advisors moved quickly, not to dismiss what had been said, but to assess it. What did this mean for protocol? For precedent? For the delicate system that governed how royal assets were passed down and presented? These were not questions with easy answers. Because Charlotte's choice, though deeply personal, challenged something much larger than herself. It forced the monarchy to confront a possibility it had long avoided: that tradition, no matter how deeply rooted, could be reshaped from within. And as those questions grew louder, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a private moment. It was a turning point, one that blurred the line between family and institution, between emotion and expectation. The simplicity of Charlotte's words had stripped away layers of formality, revealing tensions that had always existed but were rarely acknowledged. And now, those tensions were impossible to contain. What sounded like a child's preference quickly revealed something far deeper, something that struck at the very heart of royal hierarchy. For decades, the royal vault has symbolized continuity, power, and unity. But behind its polished image lies a far more complicated truth, one that insiders have long whispered about, but never dared confirm publicly. And now, Princess Charlotte of Wales's words were forcing that truth into the light. Because the vault was never just a single, unified collection. It was a carefully layered system, divided in ways the public rarely understood. There were the crown-owned jewels pieces held in trust for the monarchy itself, passed from sovereign to sovereign, bound by duty rather than desire. And then there were personal collections, quieter, more intimate, shaped by individual lives and private choices. These distinctions were rarely discussed openly, yet they defined everything. Who could wear what? When? And why? It was a system built on balance, on tradition, on silent agreement. Until now. At the center of this shifting narrative stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose personal collection had grown not just in size, but in meaning. Each piece carried its own story gifts, inheritances, carefully chosen symbols of continuity that felt less institutional and more personal. Over time, that collection had come to represent something powerful, a bridge between the past and the future, shaped not by protocol alone, but by emotional connection. And it was precisely that connection that Charlotte had chosen to align herself with, whether she fully understood the weight of that decision or not. But within palace walls, history was never far away. There had always been quiet tensions over access to certain heirlooms, disagreements softened by diplomacy. Differences managed behind closed doors. Who held authority over specific pieces was not always as straightforward as it appeared. Some jewels carried histories tied to figures whose legacies still lingered in subtle, complicated ways. Others were associated with moments of triumph or fracture that the monarchy preferred not to revisit. These were not just objects. They were symbols, and symbols had power. Charlotte's declaration disrupted that balance in a way no one had anticipated. Because by choosing Catherine's collection, she was, intentionally or not, drawing a line between what felt personal and what felt institutional. And in doing so, she raised an uncomfortable question: what did it say about the other sources? The vault, the legacy pieces, the traditions that had long defined royal identity. Was this a matter of preference or something deeper? Something rooted in trust, in perception, in the quiet dynamics that shaped life behind palace doors. The response was swift, though never public. Palace historians were quietly consulted, their role not to challenge the moment, but to understand it. Had anything like this happened before? Was there precedent for such a clear personal stance from someone so young, yet so central to the future of the monarchy? The answers were not simple, because while history offered guidance, it did not offer solutions for a moment like this one, that felt both unprecedented and inevitable at the same time. Inside the palace, discussions grew more intense. Not confrontational, but deeply reflective. How do you protect tradition without ignoring change? How do you honor legacy while allowing the next generation to redefine it? These were no longer abstract questions. They were immediate, pressing, impossible to delay. Because Charlotte's words had done something rare, they had exposed the fragile balance between duty and identity, between what was expected and what was felt. And as that realization settled in, the focus began to shift. Because there was one person who could not remain untouched by what this meant, one figure whose position, influence, and history with these very jewels made her central to everything that was unfolding next. And as the palace scrambled to contain the implications, attention began shifting to one figure who could not ignore what this meant. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't need to. Because within palace walls, silence can be louder than any statement. And as Princess Charlotte of Wales's declaration echoed through private corridors, all eyes turned to Queen Camilla, waiting, watching, and wondering how she would respond. For years, Camilla's relationship with the royal jewels had been both symbolic and deeply personal, tied not only to her role, but to the complicated history that came with it. Certain pieces carried stories that predated her, stories that could never fully be separated from the memory of Diana, Princess of Wales. That history had always required careful navigation, a balance between honoring the past and asserting her place in the present. And now, with Charlotte's quiet but decisive stance, that balance felt more fragile than ever. Because this was not just about access, it was about meaning, about who those pieces truly belonged to in the eyes of the next generation. Behind closed doors, the reaction was described as controlled, but unmistakably firm. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, only measured conversations, deliberate pauses, and a tone that suggested this moment would not simply pass. Advisors moved carefully, aware that every word, every gesture carried weight. They watched closely, not just for what Camilla would say, but for what she would choose not to say. Because in a system built on nuance, absence can speak louder than presence. Subtle changes began to surface, the kind that might go unnoticed by the public, but stood out sharply to those within the palace. Schedules shifted slightly. Appearances were adjusted. Interactions that once followed a predictable rhythm now felt more calculated, more deliberate. Nothing overt, nothing that could be pointed to directly, but enough to suggest that something beneath the surface had changed, that the equilibrium, once carefully maintained, was now under quiet strain. At the heart of it all lay a sensitivity that had never fully disappeared, the legacy of Diana and the emotional weight attached to certain heirlooms. These were not just artifacts of history, they were reminders of a story that still lived in public memory, a story that shaped perception in ways the palace could never completely control. Charlotte's choice, intentional or not, seemed to echo that history, drawing attention back to it in a way that made containment increasingly difficult. Internally, concern began to grow, not just about the decision itself, but about what would happen if it reached beyond palace walls. Because public perception could shift quickly, and once a narrative took hold, it was nearly impossible to reshape. The idea that this might be seen as a divide, as a sign of underlying tension, was something the palace was determined to avoid. Efforts to maintain unity became more deliberate, more visible in subtle ways, as if reinforcing a message that had not yet been openly challenged. But beneath that effort, the pressure was building. Because silence, no matter how carefully maintained, cannot hold forever. And the more tightly the story was contained, the more forcefully it threatened to break free. What had begun as a private moment was now brushing against the edges of something far larger, something that could not be quietly resolved behind closed doors. But the situation was no longer contained, and what happened next made it impossible to keep behind closed doors. When the balance of tradition and family begins to fracture, someone has to step forward. And this time, it was Prince William, Prince of Wales, not just as a future king, but as a father determined to protect his daughter's voice, no matter the cost. The shift was not announced. It was felt. Quiet meetings were arranged behind the same guarded doors that had witnessed the beginning of this unfolding storm. But this time, the tone was different, more direct, more resolved. William sat across from senior advisors, not as a figure seeking guidance, but as one prepared to define the direction himself. The discussions were careful, deliberate, but unmistakably firm. Because at the center of it all was a simple truth: he refused to compromise on Charlotte's voice, would not be dismissed, softened, or reshaped to fit expectations that no longer reflected the reality of the family he was raising. What made this moment so significant was not just the stance itself, but what it represented. By reinforcing Princess Charlotte of Wales's autonomy, William was drawing a line that extended far beyond a single decision. He was signaling that personal identity, even within the monarchy, could no longer be quietly overridden in the name of tradition. And within that decision lay something even more powerful, an acknowledgement of the role Catherine, Princess of Wales, played, not just as a mother, but as a defining influence in shaping the values of the next generation. There was an emphasis, subtle but undeniable, on maternal lineage, on the idea that legacy was not solely determined by institutional inheritance, but by personal connection, by trust, by the bonds formed within the family itself. It was a perspective that felt both modern and deeply disruptive, because it challenged the long-standing structure that had always prioritized the crown above all else. And while that shift may have seemed quiet on the surface, its implications were anything but. Inside those discussions, agreement was far from unanimous. Some advisors supported the direction, recognizing it as an evolution that could strengthen the monarchy's connection to a changing world. Others were more cautious, warning that such a stance could set a precedent that would be difficult to contain. Because once one boundary was redefined, others might follow. And in an institution built on continuity, even the smallest change could carry consequences that reached far into the future. The tension between preserving protocol and adapting to modern expectations became impossible to ignore. It was no longer an abstract debate, it was unfolding in real time, shaped by choices that could not be undone. William understood that. And yet, he did not step back. If anything, his resolve became clearer. Because, for him, this was not about defying tradition for the sake of it. It was about ensuring that the monarchy could evolve without losing its humanity, without losing the very connections that gave it meaning. Those closest to the situation began to see this as more than a reaction. It was a defining moment, a glimpse into the kind of leadership William intended to embody, measured, but unyielding when it mattered most. A leadership rooted not only in duty, but in conviction. And as that realization began to settle, it became clear that this decision would not remain contained within palace walls, because the echoes of that choice were already beginning to travel, moving beyond private conversations and controlled spaces, shaping perceptions in ways no one could fully predict. Yet even William may not have anticipated how deeply this decision would resonate beyond the palace walls. At first, it was just a whisper among insiders, then a murmur in media circles. And suddenly, it was everywhere. The story the palace tried so hard to contain had begun slipping into the public domain, and the reaction was immediate. What began as fragmented hints, carefully worded observations, subtle shifts noticed by those trained to read between the lines, quickly found its way into headlines that asked more questions than they answered. Journalists who had long operated on instinct began connecting pieces that once seemed unrelated. A delayed appearance here, a changed tone there, and beneath it all, the quiet emergence of a narrative centered around Princess Charlotte of Wales, a narrative that felt too precise, too consistent, to dismiss as coincidence. The palace had tried to contain it, to keep it within controlled boundaries, but the story had already begun to move on its own. As traditional media started circling the subject, social platforms ignited with speculation. Conversations multiplied, theories evolved, and what had once been a guarded internal matter became a global discussion. The simplicity of Charlotte's reported words gave the story its power. There was no complexity to obscure it, no ambiguity to dilute it. It was clear, direct, and that clarity made it impossible to ignore. People responded not just with curiosity, but with emotion, because at its core, this was not about protocol or policy. It was about a child's voice asserting itself within an institution that had rarely allowed such moments to surface. Public sentiment began to form quickly, and it leaned in a direction that caught many within the palace off guard. Support gathered around Charlotte and Catherine, Princess of Wales, not as figures of authority, but as individuals connected by something deeply human. That connection resonated. It felt authentic in a way that institutional narratives often struggled to achieve. And as that resonance grew, it began to reshape the conversation itself, shifting focus away from tradition and toward identity, trust, and belonging. Royal commentators entered the discussion with measured analysis, but even their interpretations revealed the weight of the moment. Some framed it as a natural evolution, a sign that the monarchy was adapting to a new generation. Others warned of deeper implications, suggesting that such a visible departure from established norms could unsettle a system built on continuity. The debate was no longer confined to insiders. It had become a public examination of what the monarchy was and what it might become. Inside the palace, the response was careful, almost surgical. Statements were crafted with precision, offering acknowledgement without confirmation, presence without detail. Every word was chosen to maintain balance, to avoid amplifying what could no longer be denied, yet could not be fully addressed. But the absence of clarity only intensified the pressure. Because in a world where information moves faster than control, silence does not contain a story, it fuels it. Questions began to mount, not just from the public, but from within the institution itself. What did this moment mean for the future of royal traditions? Could established practices withstand the weight of personal conviction when expressed so openly? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was this an isolated incident, or the beginning of something far more transformative? The momentum continued to build, carrying the story beyond speculation into something more profound. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the debates and the carefully managed responses, there was a shift taking place, quiet but undeniable. A shift that suggested this was not simply about one decision or one voice, but about a changing understanding of legacy itself. But beneath the headlines and speculation, a deeper question was beginning to take shape, one that could redefine everything. This was never just about jewels. It was about legacy, who defines it, who carries it, and who ultimately decides what it means for the next generation. And in that moment, Princess Charlotte of Wales's voice became something far greater than anyone expected. Because when Charlotte drew that quiet line, choosing pieces from Catherine, Princess of Wales's personal collection over those held within the institution, she did more than express a preference. She reshaped a narrative that had been building for generations. For centuries, royal inheritance had been defined by structure, by rules that placed the crown at the center of everything. The jewels were never just adornments, they were symbols of authority, of continuity, of a system that outlived individuals. But Charlotte's decision shifted that focus, even if only slightly, toward something more intimate, something more human. It suggested that legacy could be chosen, not just assigned. That subtle shift carried a weight that could not be ignored. Because if meaning could be drawn from personal connection rather than institutional expectation, then the entire perception of royal collections began to evolve. What once stood as untouchable symbols of tradition now faced a new reality, one where emotional resonance mattered just as much as historical significance. And while that idea might have seemed small at first glance, its implications stretched far beyond a single moment. It introduced the possibility that future generations might approach these decisions differently, guided not only by duty, but by identity. Within palace circles, that realization settled slowly, but firmly. Conversations that once focused on preservation began to include questions of interpretation. Historians, long accustomed to looking backward, now found themselves considering what might lie ahead. Had there ever been a moment like this before? Perhaps not in such a clear form, because while the monarchy had always adapted, those adaptations were often subtle, almost invisible to the outside world. This, however, was different. This was visible. felt. Understood in a way that could not be easily reframed or quietly absorbed. And at the center of that shift stood Catherine, not through declaration, but through presence. Her influence, once seen as part of a broader role, now appeared more defined, more central to the shaping of what came next. Not as a replacement for tradition, but as a bridge between what had been and what could become. Charlotte's choice reflected that influence in a way that no official title ever could. It spoke of trust, of connection, of a legacy that extended beyond protocol into something far more personal. But with that realization came uncertainty. If one generation could redefine meaning, what would the next do with that freedom? Would future heirs follow the same path, choosing connection over convention? Or would they be drawn back toward the structure that had defined the monarchy for so long? These were not questions with immediate answers. But they lingered, shaping the way the moment was understood not as an endpoint, but as a beginning. Inside the palace, there was a growing awareness that something fundamental was shifting. Not collapsing, not breaking, but evolving. Quietly, steadily, in ways that could not be reversed. The monarchy, often seen as unchanging, was revealing its ability to adapt in real time. And that adaptation was being driven not by decree, but by voice, by choice, by a moment that had seemed small, but had grown into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. And just when it seemed the story had reached its peak, one final revelation threatened to change everything again. In the end, it wasn't the vaults, the protocols, or even the traditions that defined this moment. It was a single choice, clear, unwavering, and impossible to ignore. And as the dust began to settle, one thing became certain: nothing would ever be quite the same again. What followed was not a grand announcement or a sweeping declaration. Instead, it was something far more subtle, and perhaps more powerful. The palace did not deny it. It did not confirm it outright either. But within that carefully maintained silence, there was an acknowledgement. A quiet acceptance that Princess Charlotte of Wales's preference would stand. No official statement was needed, because the shift was already taking place behind the scenes. Adjustments were made, discreetly but deliberately, ensuring that when the time came, her choices would be respected without challenge. It was not a rewrite of the rules, but it was a redefinition of how those rules could be applied. And at the center of that transformation stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, her role no longer just symbolic, but foundational. What had once been seen as influence now carried the weight of direction. Through Charlotte's decision, Catherine's position in shaping the emotional and personal identity of the monarchy became undeniable. Not through authority imposed, but through trust earned. It was a quiet power, but one that resonated deeply, signaling that legacy was no longer confined to institutions alone. It lived within relationships, within choices, within the bonds that defined a new generation. Beside her, Prince William, Prince of Wales's stance, reinforced that shift with a clarity that left little room for doubt. His support had not been loud, but it had been firm, and in that firmness was a vision of the future one, where leadership was not just about preserving what had been, but about guiding what could become. It was a delicate balance, one that required both respect for tradition and the courage to allow it to evolve. And in this moment, William had shown that he was prepared to walk that line, even when it led into uncertain territory. For Queen Camilla, the path forward remained more complex. Outwardly, stability was maintained. Appearances continued, roles upheld, the image of unity preserved with careful precision. But beneath that surface, the dynamics had shifted in ways that could not be fully undone. Her position, once firmly defined within the structure of tradition, now existed within a landscape that was quietly changing. Not weakened, but undeniably more delicate, shaped by forces that extended beyond control. Beyond the palace walls, the impact was already taking hold. Public perception began to evolve, moving toward a view of the monarchy that felt more human, more emotionally connected, more reflective of the world it existed within. What had once seemed distant now felt closer, more relatable, not because the institution had changed overnight, but because a single moment had revealed its capacity to change it all. And that realization carried its own kind of power. Because this was never just about one decision. It was about what that decision represented. A shift in how legacy is understood. A reimagining of how tradition can coexist with individuality. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that even within the most established systems, transformation often begins in the quietest ways, with a voice that refuses to be ignored. Because sometimes, the smallest voices create the loudest echoes, and this was only the beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.